Policy Advisor, Jacob Smith, for all of the hard work they have done on this important issue. I also, as I begin, want to thank Senator Boxer for her wonderful leadership of the Environmental Committee and for her strong activism regarding climate change. And I want to thank Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schatz as well for organizing this important discussion tonight. Mr. President, the scientific community has been extremely clear, no debate. Climate change is real, climate change is man-made, and climate change is already causing severe damage in terms of drought, floods, forest fires, rising sea levels, and extreme weather disturbances. Given that reality, I find it extremely disturbing that virtually all, not all, but virtually all of my Republican colleagues continue to ignore the scientific evidence and refuse to support serious legislation which will address this planetary crisis. My hope is that my small state of Vermont will be a national leader, will be a model for the rest of the country in transforming our energy system, moving us away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And doing that, by the way, will not only help the United States become a leader in reversing climate change, but can, over a period of years, create millions of good-paying jobs in this country. And that has got to be the goal. Now, Mr. President, some people ask, many people ask, they say, well, why aren't you guys doing anything on this issue? The scientific community is almost unanimous about the causation of climate change, about its severity. What are you doing? And let me answer that by just very briefly reading an exchange that took place on the floor of the Senate on April 11, 2013. And let me preface my remarks by saying that Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma is a friend of mine. I like Jim Inhofe. He is an honest person, straightforward person. But on this issue, he is dead wrong. And this is the exchange that took place on April 11, 2013. I was on the floor, and this is what I said. I said, what Senator Inhofe has written, and he has published a book on this issue, what Senator Inhofe has written and talked about is his belief that global warming is one of the major hoaxes ever perpetrated on the American people. That it's a hoax pushed by people like Al Gore, the United Nations, and the Hollywood elite. And then Senator Inhofe was here on the floor, and I said, I think that is a fair quote from Senator Inhofe. Is that roughly right, Senator Inhofe? And he was right here. And Mr. Inhofe said, yes. I would add to that list, MoveOn.org, George Soros, Michael Moore, and a few others, end of quote. So that is where we are. We have a gentleman, again, a very honest, decent man who I like, former chair of the Environmental Committee, former ranking member of the Environmental Committee, who believes that global warming is a hoax pushed by people like Al Gore, the United Nations, and the Hollywood elite. So when people ask me why we are not doing anything, I would say that is pretty much the reason. But let me respond to that, to Mr. Inhofe's views, by saying the following. Climate change is real, and there is no longer a scientific debate about that. In the words of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which includes EPA, NASA, the National Science Foundation, and the Departments of Defense, Energy, State, Health, Interior, Transportation, and Commerce, I quote, global warming is unequivocal and primarily human-induced, end of quote. That is not my view. It's not Senator Boxer's view. not Senator Schatz's view. That is the view of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which includes some of the major agencies of the United States government. And by the way, clearly it is not just the United States government or agencies that believe that. There are agencies representing virtually every country on earth who have come to the same conclusion. Now, when some people say, Mr. President, well, there is a debate, the evidence is not yet clear, the scientific community is not quite sure, let me clear the air on that one. According to a study published in the journal Environmental Research Letters in May of last year, more than 97% of the peer-reviewed scientific literature on climate supports the view that human activity is a primary cause of global warming. I believe I read yesterday that the minority leader, Senator McConnell of Kentucky, was saying, well, for every person who believes that climate change is real, there's another person who disagrees. Well, the polling indicates that's not quite accurate, but what is really important is not what this person feels or what that person feels. It is what those people who have studied the issue extensively believe. That really is what matters. And for those people, the 97% of the peer-reviewed scientific literature on this issue, they say very clearly that climate change is real and that human activity is a primary cause of global warming. And I am reminded, and I think Senator Boxer made this point a while ago, that the debate that we're having now is very reminiscent about the debate we had 30 or 40 years ago about the role that tobacco plays in cancer and emphysema and heart conditions and so forth. And we had people well-funded by the tobacco institutes coming before the American people, putting ads on television saying, you know, smoking is okay. There is no evidence linking smoking to cancer. Well, they were lying, as a matter of fact, and many of these people were being funded by the Tobacco Institute, and I think we are in the same position now. A lot of the information, the misinformation that is coming forward is funded by the fossil fuel industry, and we should be clear about that. Is there still a scientific debate about anything related to climate? What's the debate? Well, the only remaining scientific debates are about just how devastating climate change will be. And of that, the scientists are not exactly sure, and there is a disagreement. Are we on track for a 2-degree change by the end of the century? Will the planet warm up by 2 degrees? Will it warm up by 4 degrees? Will it warm up by 6 degrees? People are not exactly sure, but they are certainly sure that it will warm up. Will sea levels rise by 1 foot? Will they rise by 3 feet, by 4 feet? Again, scientists are not clear, but they are absolutely clear that sea levels will rise. Mr. President, as a result of industrial greenhouse gas emissions, Earth's climate warmed more between 1971 and 2000 than during any other 3-decade interval in the last 1,400 years, reports a paper in the journal Nature Geoscience based on research conducted by 78 scientists from 24 nations, analyzing climate data from tree rings, pollen, cave formations, ice cores, lake and ocean sediments, and historical records from around the sea. The globe has already warmed 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit from 1880 to 2012, and the vast majority of that warming, 1.1 degree Fahrenheit, has happened since 1950. According to NOAA, November 2013 was the hottest November on record. 2012 was the warmest year on record in the contiguous United States and saw at least 69,000 local heat records set. 2013 was the 4th warmest year ever recorded since 1880. Mr. President, the World Bank, no bastion of left-leaning environmental thinking, is among those expressing its grave concern about the trends. The World Bank concluded that limiting the global temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade might allow us to keep sea level rise by 2100 to less than 2.3 feet. Unfortunately, the World Bank also acknowledges that we are on track for a 4 degrees centigrade increase, which would result in extreme heat waves and life-threatening sea level rise. Mr. President, since 1901, the global sea level has risen about 7.5 inches, and it is getting worse. Over the last 20 years, seas have been rising nearly twice as fast. All over the world, glaciers and ice packs are melting. Glaciers in the Mount Everest region have shrunk by 13% in the last 50 years. Glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania have already shrunk by 80% and are expected to be completely gone by 2020. Greenland's ice sheets lost ice at a rate of about 60 cubic miles per year between 2022 and 2011. This is 6 times faster than the ice was melting during the decade before that. All of these impacts and more can be traced directly to carbon emissions and their effects on the atmosphere. Mr. President, in 2013, as you well know, we witnessed an ominous milestone. The daily mean concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere surpassed 400 parts per million. The last time CO2 levels were this high was probably between 2.2 million and 3.6 million years ago, when it was so warm that there were forests in Greenland. Now, Mr. President, what does climate change mean? What are the consequences of global warming? How is climate change already impacting our lives? Not in 5 years, not in 50 years, but right now. For one thing, climate change is making droughts in the western United States and in other parts of the world more severe, longer lasting, and more frequent. Scientists expect that precipitation patterns will continue shifting, expanding the geographic extent of the dry subtropics, leading to warmer and drier weather, which then causes air temperatures to increase even more. This helps explain why drought-stricken Texas saw the hottest summer ever recorded for a U.S. state in 2011, leading to a combination of drought and wildfire costing $10 billion in damage, and the drought continues. As of last month, Texas had only received 68% of its normal rainfall between 2011 and 2013, and reservoirs are at their lowest level since 1990. But it is not, and we should be very clear about this, when we talk about global warming, we are talking about the globe, the global community, not just the United States, not just Texas, not just California. Mr. President, Australia last year endured an angry summer, which is what it was called, which brought both the hottest month and the hottest day the country has ever witnessed, and a 4-month heat wave, severe wildfires, and torrential rains and flooding, causing $2.4 billion in damages. Last year's heat wave in China was the worst in at least 140 years. And these droughts have very real consequences for water availability. Many regions in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are expected to experience a decline of 20% in water availability if the climate warms 2 degrees centigrade, and 50% declines if the climate warms by 4 degrees centigrade. What we are talking about here is the inability of people to get water to drink, the inability of people to get water to farm. And this then leads to other problems, including mass migrations and struggles over limited natural resources. Mr. President, with sustained drought and heat waves comes wildfire. As Thomas Tidwell, Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, explained to Congress last year, America's wildfire season now lasts 2 months longer than it did 40 years ago, 2 months longer than just 40 years ago, and burns up twice as much land as it did then because of the hotter, drier conditions from climate change. And we're seeing this very, very horrendous and expensive situation of wildfires in the southwest of this country. Mr. President, wildfires, in fact, are expected to increase 50% across the United States under a changing climate, while some studies predict increases of more than 100% in parts of areas of the western United States by 2050. So when you think about climate change and you think about drier forests, we are looking at very, very serious problems regarding wildfires. Mr. President, rising sea levels, another great concern and impact of climate change, also leads to more destructive storm surges. According to NOAA, Hurricane Sandy's storm surge exceeded 14 feet in places, which was a record for New York City. The National Academy of Sciences estimated that for every 1.8 degree Fahrenheit increase in global average surface temperatures, there could be a 2-fold to 7-fold increase in the risk of extreme storm surge events similar to Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. And when some people tell us, well, gee, we can't afford to address the problems of climate change, I would suggest that we cannot afford not to address this crisis, if only for the kinds of money that we're going to have to be spending repairing the damage of hurricanes like Sandy and maybe hurricanes that are even worse. Mr. President, we heard during a recent Senate Environment Committee hearing that Florida, state of Florida, has already seen 5 to 8 inches of sea level rise in the past 50 years with no end in sight. In the Florida Keys, we expect that nearly 90% of Monroe County would be completely inundated at high tide with just 3 of sea level rise. And New Orleans can expect to see an ocean level increase of well over 4 feet by the end of the century. In other words, what we are looking at here in Florida, Miami, Louisiana, New Orleans, Massachusetts, Boston, New York City, what we are looking at is sea rising, which actually threatens the very existence of parts of those cities. Experts are predicting that cities like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, New York, and New Orleans will face a growing threat of partial submersion within just a few decades as sea levels and storm surge levels continue to climb. Mr. President, what will it mean if the seas continue to rise and if extreme weather events, severe droughts, wildfires, storms, flooding become much more common? One of the most important consequences will be massive human dislocation all over the world. More than 32 million people fled their homes in 2012 because of disasters such as floods and storms. An estimated 98% of this displacement was related to climate change. So when you look into the future, and one of the reasons that agencies like the CIA and the Department of Defense and other security agencies worry very much about climate change is they see the national security implications of mass dislocations of people in different countries or regions of a country fighting over limited resources, water, land, in order to survive. The Department of Defense, in its 2010 quadrennial review, called climate change a potential, quote, accelerant of instability or conflict, end of quote. Mr. President, the potential economic impact of climate change on agriculture, for example, is huge. Water scarcity will make it harder to irrigate fields, and higher temperatures will make some areas unsuitable for growing crops. A study from the International Food Policy Research Institute found that globally, climate change will greatly increase prices for staple crops such as corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans, including an approximately 100% increase in the price of wheat. So what this means for Americans, for people all over the world who are already struggling economically, what it means is that climate change will mean less areas being farmed and higher food prices, something that we really cannot afford right now. Mr. President, I think the question that some viewers may have is, if the science is so clear, and it really is quite clear here in the United States and around the world, why don't we fix it? Why don't we come up with the bold strategy that we need so that America is a leader in the world in cutting greenhouse gas emissions and transforming our energy system? And the good news here is that the transformation of our energy system is going to be less expensive, if you like, than doing nothing. Doing nothing means that we will see higher food prices, we will see wildfires, we will see scarcities of food, we will see weather disturbances wreaking havoc on communities all over America and the world, requiring huge amounts of money to address those problems. So what is the alternative? What do we begin to do? And I think the answer is, and the good news is, that we right now, today, we have the technology to begin the process of significantly transforming our energy system. We know how to do it with today's technology, and that technology will only be improved in months and years to come. Let me just give you a few examples of some of the good news that's happening in terms of the ability that we now have to move to sustainable energy. The cost of solar, which certainly will be one of the major sustainable energy technologies that we look to in the future, that technology costs continue to plummet. The Solar Energy Industry Association, in a report issued just last week, reported that the average weighted cost of a solar PV system was $2.59 per watt, a 15% drop from the year before. And according to the Solar Energy Industry Association, utility-scale solar, perhaps the best comparison to utility-scale conventional electricity generation, now costs on average 7.7 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to about 10 cents per kilowatt hour on average for power plants now operating across the United States. The cost of wind energy is also comparable to, or even less than, the cost of other more traditional energy sources. The average cost of wind power coming online between now and 2018 is estimated to be 8.6 cents per kilowatt hour, even without including the value of the production tax credit. Moving to sustainable energies like solar and wind and geothermal and biomass and hydropower clearly is something that we should be doing very, very aggressively. And, Mr. President, when we do that, we not only cut greenhouse gas emissions, we not only significantly cut air pollution, but in the process we create many, many jobs as we transform our energy system. But sustainable energy is only one part of the equation. What we must also do is invest very, very significantly in energy efficiency and in sustainable energy. Every dollar invested in efficiency in low-income households through the Weatherization Assistance Program results in $2.53 in energy and non-energy benefits for a community. Mr. President, I suspect the story is the same in Maine as it is in Vermont, but I can remember a meeting with two older women who were sisters who lived in Barre, Vermont, and they were able to get their home weatherized. Their home, as many homes in Vermont are, were old, were leaking energy, not well insulated, did not have good windows, did not have good roofing, and the heat was just going right through the walls. And as a result of a weatherization project in their home, their fuel bill went down by 50%, and these were low-income senior citizens. So when we move in this direction, we can save Americans substantial sums on their fuel bills, we create local jobs, we cut greenhouse gas emissions. If that is not a win-win-win situation, then I don't know what is. Mr. President, it seems to me that we should be investing substantially in subsidies like the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. Every dollar that we invest in these efforts yields many, many more in savings. It is also true, Mr. President, that when some of my friends object to the government helping to assist sustainable energies or putting money into energy efficiency, they seem to forget that the very, very mature and very, very profitable fossil fuel industry benefits very, very substantially from the subsidies that we have provided them. In fact, American taxpayers are set to give away over $100 billion to the oil, gas, and coal industries over the next decade through a wide range of subsidies, tax breaks, and tax loopholes. And, Mr. President, if we can subsidize the coal industry, if we can subsidize ExxonMobil and the oil industry, if we can subsidize the gas industry, we sure as heck can subsidize and provide support for wind, solar, and other sustainable energies. Mr. President, let me come to maybe the end of my remarks here and suggest the following. And that is, the time is now for us to take bold and decisive action. As my colleague, Senator Franken, mentioned, those of us who have kids, and I have 4, those of us who have grandchildren, and I have 7 beautiful grandchildren, they will look us in the eye 20 years from now and say, why did you let this happen? Didn't you know what was happening? Didn't you understand what lack of action would do for our country and the planet? That is the issue that we face. We need to have the courage now to stand up to extremely wealthy and powerful forces in big energy, and that's the coal companies, that's the oil companies, the gas companies, and come up with an alternative vision for energy in America. And in that regard, I am proud to have joined with my colleague, the chair of the Environmental Committee, Senator Barbara Boxer, to introduce last year the Climate Protection Act. And our bill does what, at the end of the day, every serious person understands must be done, and that is to establish a fee on carbon pollution emissions, an approach, by the way, endorsed not just by progressives, but also by moderates and even prominent conservatives like George Shultz, Nobel laureate economist Gary Becker, who is Mitt Romney's former economic advisor, George McEnroe, former Reagan advisor Art Laffer, and former Republican Congressman Bob Inglis. In other words, there is an understanding that if we are to be serious about addressing the need to cut carbon emissions, there has got to be a tax on those emissions. And our legislation, which has been endorsed by I believe almost every major environmental organization does several things. What we do in a very, very significant way is invest in energy efficiency and weatherization, because that is the low-hanging fruit. What we also do is invest very significantly in sustainable energy. And also, importantly, in the event that folks are paying increased costs for electricity or for other areas, much of the money is returned directly to taxpayers. So let me conclude, Mr. President, by saying the following. We can have an honest debate about the best path forward to transform our energy system. This is complicated stuff, and I don't think anyone has the magic answer. So we can debate that. But we can no longer debate whether climate change is real, whether it is caused by human activity, or whether it is today causing serious harm to our country and serious damage all over this planet, or whether that devastation will only get worse in years to come. Right now, we have got to summon up the courage to acknowledge that we are in a crisis situation, that bold action is needed now. And I happen to believe that with the United States playing a leadership role, China, India, Russia, other major consumers of fossil fuels will follow our leadership. Our credibility is not much if we are not putting our actions, we're not doing things compared to just what we're talking about. So if we want to lead the world, we have got to act. And I think this is something that our children and our grandchildren expect of us, and something that I hope we can in fact do. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.